right, so session 2 is titled Security, so I'm hoping we can stick to topic somewhat. And Sascha's going to speak first.
Hi, I'm Sascha. I'm going to talk about the challenges of bringing crypto from research papers to products in interview study. So we have like a huge pile of crypto research output, like lots of papers, lots of like standards and everything. And bringing this to products is like a bumpy path. Like lots of ideas, they don't get deployed at all, or like there are like, I don't know, vulnerabilities, they are hard to use. So this mainly motivated our research, and our like overarching question was what kind of blocks the adoption. Yeah, so what makes it so complicated? We conducted 21 interviews with people who have like or had some sort of experience. In particular, all had like at least 10 years of like crypto experience in one way or the other. Most were from had an academic background. Some came from industry, and most of them were involved in at least designing and analyzing crypto. Some even like in standardization processes, in deploying implementation and everything. So we were interested in their background and experiences, and in the adoption blockers and ideas for improvements they either experienced themselves or kind of had ideas of. So based on the data we collected, we came up with this kind of simplified version of we could have made it even more like more complicated. Like the idea is that like on the left we have like the theory people. They produce like mostly papers, like the math people. Then the crypto analysts come in and kind of kill some of the ideas or help to make them even better. Then the next step would be like some of the theory output in some cases even has some sort of code reference implementations. Then standardization comes in after the standardization. Like some of the stuff gets implemented as part of libraries, and this then turns into products, and then end users and organizations use what comes out of the implementation step. So really like super simple path. So we identified 5 challenges during the adoption. One was, or the like most mentioned challenge was misaligned incentives in academia. So it was that people complained that practical impact doesn't get people crypto papers, that the theory people don't invest enough time into writing code that is kind of usable. We'll come to that in a minute. And yeah, they hypothesized that there might be some incentive problem in academia to kind of make that adoption easier. Challenge number 2 were standardization processes. So we learned that different stakeholders might have diverging goals. So for academics, our participants mentioned that standardization work is like tiring and tedious and unrewarding, and some of our participants complained that some industries stakeholders kind of abuse standardization processes to push their own things for financial gain. And we learned that there is some at times a misunderstanding between stakeholders, in particular in terms of using the same kind of vocabulary. Yeah. Reference implementations were brought up, so it's that I already mentioned it. At like some point, some code kind of is released, and that usually is never thought to be like production ready. But no big surprise, some people still use it. So some people kind of just copy the non-production ready reference implementations into kind of products, and then like huge number of vulnerabilities pop up and so on. We learned that there are particular communication gaps between theory and practice, and people complain about like a shortage of such translators. So I really like this quote. It was from like one theory person who clearly said that this person really doesn't want to understand the problem of the application, the problem with the users. But they also kind of mentioned that it's slowly becoming better. So actually talking to each other kind of gets rewarded in the community, even at the crypto conferences. Challenge number 5 is, got it, or was low usability. Again, coming back to the reference implementations. So we learned that many reference implementations, they are highly like optimized code, hard to understand, hard to kind of base actual implementations on. And our participants also kind of complained that there was often a clash between like desired functionality for end users. So I think we already heard it in the session before. In some cases, it just takes away like lots of cool features people want in products and software. Final slide. We got some suggestions for improvement. A lot of them are about changing people, so might be challenging. But yeah, one idea was, or one suggestion was kind of making academics becoming more active in the standardization processes, supporting kind of industry into implementing more transparent crypto like WhatsApp did for end-to-end. And in particular for standardization processes, kind of participants wanted more open standardization processes. All right, was it 8 minutes?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. All right, Adam, you're up.
Okay. All right. Hi. Good morning. My name is Joinson, University of Bath. I'm going to talk about how we can predict violent offences, political offences. I'm going to end with my start with my conclusion because I might run out of time, which is that using the internet for know-how to talk about weapons is a much more kind of powerful indicator of violent mobilisation than hate speech or ideology. So what people do rather than what they think. Some fantastic collaborators, and the research is funded and part of the Centre for Research and Evidence on Security Threats, the kind of UK Intelligence Communities Research Centre, which has been running for 9 years now. So what we're interested in is what's the relationship between online behaviour and offline action. We've seen across both the US and in the UK lots of occasions where people have taken part in the most terrible acts and they've posted content online. So this is Robert Bowers, who did the Tree of Life shooting synagogue in Pittsburgh. He posted immediately before he went and committed his atrocity, and he had a whole history of these kinds of posts. Similarly, say Sozak, the MAGA bomber who sent viable pipe bombs to 20 progressives across the US, also had a very kind of strong digital footprint. And Brenton Tarrant in New Zealand, who did the Christchurch mosque attack, also posted lots online, which would be indicative that he was going to commit a crime in some shape or other. So we wanted to start with non-problematic behaviours. So we thought, okay, we're in kind of a post-Brexit vote era in the UK, so we decided to look at people's mobilisation around Brexit. And we looked at a particular protest, a People's Vote March, which was one of the largest protests against Brexit, asking for a second vote, almost 1 million people on the streets of London. We collected tweets both before and after the day of a protest, and we built an attendance classifier. And we could predict with 80% accuracy whether or not people attended or not. Primarily, they posted photos and they used mobile devices. It's not a big surprise people are not lugging around PCs at protests. Interestingly, we wrote to over 6,000 people who'd used the hashtag and asked them to fill out a survey to actually generate ground truth. We got 750 people who responded, which was quite impressive, but we were banned constantly from Twitter for using our own messaging, and fantastic research who did this. Then we built a polarization index by scraping 200 people from our ground truth data set back a year. We got their permission, we asked, and we scored their tweets by things like the level of anger, harm, the kind of grievance stuff that you'd normally expect would be mobilizing. And with a few colleagues in math, we built a polarization index which allowed us to look at people's change in how angry they got over the preceding year. The level of online polarization didn't predict offline mobilization. Becoming more angry has no impact whatsoever. Interestingly though, social validation, having your angry posts liked by people, is much more likely to predict mobilization. And we're talking 9 to 12 months kind of preceding the actual offline event. So the next thing we want to know is, okay, what about more problematic behaviours? So we built a database of extreme right-wing offenders, and then we looked to find out online traces. So using existing databases and also a bit of open source intelligence, we found almost 140 offenders. Most were male, most were in the US, 20% from the UK, 17 life sentences, average sentence was 8 years. All had engaged in some form of political violence, motivated by either neo-Nazi or other extreme right-wing beliefs. Then what we needed to do was link these people to online personas. For some it was easy. Robert Bowers used the moniker One Dingo, and it was obvious in his Gap dataset. Others, we had 2 people scoring, and we had to be absolutely certain that we could tie people up. And we had 3 datasets: Ironmarch, which was hacked and released, Discord chats, which Unicorn Riot, a progressive media collective, had also released, and Gab. We had 26 people who had been mobilised and convicted, and 54 who we chose as kind of similar matched people. They were very well known. We used Anti-Defamation League, Hope Not Hate, and so on to identify people who were known extreme right-wingers. We then had a researcher do content analysis of 20 of these people, 10 mobilised and 10 non-mobilised. And she worked through 36,289 posts from various kind of unpleasant places. And what you'll see is the most interesting differences are in the top. So she identified 9 themes. The top 3 are the ones where, mostly the convicted and the non-convicted, mobilised, non-mobilised differed. But actually, group formation, hey guys, let's get together and do something. Talking about weapons and inciting violence were the strongest differences between those who were mobilised and those who were not. We then went to developing topic models. I'm going to skip past this because there's some unpleasant stuff on there. And we ended up with a 4-topic model approach by combining our qualitative work and the topic modelling. And we could predict, you can see the accuracy and the balanced accuracy of between 77% and 63% of people's status in terms of whether they were mobilised or not. And what you can see when we look at the feature importance is that punctuation, people kind of using lots of exclamation marks, is a strong predictor. But also, in both the 4-topic model and the 15-topic model solution, violent action comes out as the strongest predictor. People talking about weapons, talking about police, evading police, and all sorts of things like this, not being angry. Shapley reiterates this, that actually violent action, higher level of that talk, is predictive of being mobilised. Hate speech, which all the radicalisation researchers study, is actually lower levels of hate speech predict action. So hate speech radicalisation research doesn't predict whether someone's going to actually go on and take action. So back to the conclusion, which hopefully I am just about in time. I've got 54 seconds. I can carry on. Use of the internet for know-how, violent kind of expression, is much more indicative of violent mobilisation than hate speech or ideology. All radicalisation and terrorism theories tend to focus on the pathway to ending up in these forums. So, the angry speech and the hate speech. But in an environment where everyone is engaging in hate speech, being able to kind of identify it is no use whatsoever when it comes to actually predicting whether someone's going to go and take action. In fact, focusing on hate speech, ideology, radicalisation may be counterproductive when it comes to predicting whether someone's going to move from being a kind of keyboard warrior to taking action. Thank you.
Alan, you're up. Oh, no slide guy.
No slides, yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. So this is a project in collaboration with Rick Wash and our colleague Clinton Castro at the University of Wisconsin on what we want to call, or what I want to call, positive security. The gist of the project, though Rick may disagree here, is to develop a conception of security, including cybersecurity, personal security, financial security, and so on, that's based on a conception of good rather than an absence of threat. And to get there, I want to start with a case. This case is currently before the Supreme Court. In fact, it might come down as we're sitting here, the final opinion there. It's called Murphy v. Missouri. And in Murphy v. Missouri, 2 states and a number of individuals sued the federal government, sued the Biden administration, because a number of federal agencies are in fairly consistent communication with social media companies, trying to get our social media people here, to talk with them about content that might be demoted or removed on the basis of its legality, public health threats, terrorist threats, election interference, and the like. For our purposes here, I want to describe a couple of those communications just to get a sense of what I'm talking about. So one example is Department of Homeland Security will provide awareness briefings to social media companies in order that they might recognize and react to violent extremist content posted by terrorist groups. At times, the FBI learns that a social media account appears to be controlled by a covert, malign foreign actor, and it may share account details to allow a company to determine whether that violates terms of service. The FBI informs platforms of hack and dump efforts, where state-sponsored groups communicate contents of hacked and leaked information. And the DHS, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, will communicate information about false election-related information, including things like false statements about time, place, and manner regarding elections. Usually that information comes from state election officials, but it's filtered through DHS, communicated to social media companies, and there's not any recommendation attached, just information that social media companies can do with what they will. Now, the legal action here is the First Amendment complaint. The plaintiffs here allege that these kind of communications are inherently coercive, and they therefore violate the First Amendment. The district court, that's the Western District of Louisiana, enjoined government actions here. The Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit modified the injunction, stayed the injunction, and was granted certiorari by the U.S. Supreme Court. The case was heard in March, and like I said, could come down any time. Now, so why am I talking about this? Just a legal case. Thank you. That's five
Five.
left?
Five
Okay,
left.
yeah, that makes sense. So leaving
started.
Leaving the First Amendment and government involvement in speech contours of the case aside from that's not really what I want to focus here. I want to talk about this case in terms of security. Now, in one sense, security issue in Murphy is pretty straightforward. The FBI seeks to address terrorist organizations and hostile state-sponsored groups using social media sites to organize, recruit, finance, and the like. Seeks to limit the degree to which those organizations can sow discord through misinformation, sure. And CISA seeks to avoid election interference via misinformation. But I think what I want to use the case for here is to think about security a little bit more broadly. I want to think about it in terms of a broader sense. And what I mean by that is that the FBI and CISA are addressing a certain kind of attack, right? They're worried about, or they're trying to address particular attacks from without. And I think that's this kind of negative sense of security, right? Negative as opposed to what I want to call positive. That broader positive sense that I think Murthy makes vivid is that what's worth securing in these cases is people's ability to make use of things for good or justifiable purposes, to use social media sites for communication, understanding that they can communicate without certain kinds of interference, the ability to make use of elections and election infrastructures to engage in democratic processes. And that's positive security. So if we think of security if we think of the Murthy cases involving three things, I think that together those are a more positive rather than negative sense of security. So one, these attacks that the FBI, CISA seek to minimize. Second is people's ongoing ability to make use of social networks with a degree of confidence that the information they receive isn't misinformation, isn't election misinformation, product of hacking up operations and the like. This is similar to what some philosophers, among them Monique Wonderly, refer to as affective security. That is, it's subjective in a sense, allows people to function in a certain kind of way. And third is the relation between these, right? Affective security, the confidence, ability to act in a certain kind of way, doesn't make sense if there are genuine threats, right? Someone shouldn't be oblivious to threats or acting with confidence where they ought not. And I think that is a full understanding of what the government's actions are in Murthy. Not just protection of threats, not just people's affective security ability to function, but creating a justification. That is, creating the kind of facts on the ground such that there are entities that look out for a clean communication environment, for elections that are relatively free of misinformation about time, place, and manner, and the like. And that, I think, is important. And I want to come back to Mark. I want to close by talking about Mark's presentation before, and I really liked it. I liked it because Mark led with this claim about what communications are. They are, or what the point is. What the point is of encryption. Or what the point is of Facebook Messenger apps. And that is for people to actually communicate, for people to develop relationships and foster those relationships and engage in the kind of exchange of communication that actually makes relationships worth having and things worth doing. And that is the thing. Like, that's positive security there, I think, is protecting the thing that matters, making it free from attacks, and giving people a justification for the ability to operate within those systems confidently. And Murthy has that same structure. Thanks.
Frank, you're up. Do you have slides?
I don't have slides.
Okay.
So my name is Frank Stajano. I'm a full professor at the University of Cambridge, professor of security and privacy, and I was one of Rossi's first PhD students when he still was a lecturer, which is an assistant professor. And I'm going to organize a one-day memorial event and Festschrift in Cambridge, the original Cambridge, on the 25th of March, 2025, and I'll say more about that at lunch. So now I'm going to speak about the paper I published last year called Sleepwalking into Disaster, Requirements Engineering for Digital Cash. And there's a link to that in the page that Bruce prepared. So cash is inevitably becoming digital. Where could this take us? And besides freeing up from having to carry a wallet, digital currency is something that can be traced, maybe to stop tax evaders, to track down criminals. Digital currency can be programmed. You can make payments conditional. Imagine helicopter money that, if you didn't spend it by a certain date, would self-destruct, would have an expiry date like milk. My dollars and euro dollars could be programmed differently. And all this is possible, and some of it has already been implemented. Some of it's already been deployed and trialed. And where are we heading with all this? Let's stop and think. Before we build and we entrench, a technological infrastructure that will be with us for the rest of this century. So I'll make 5 claims in this presentation. My first claim is that digital cash is unstoppably happening, but it won't be Bitcoin or any other copycat cryptocurrency. It will be CBDCs, central bank digital currency. The biggest technical problem with digital cash is to prevent double spending, because digital cash is a string of bits which can be copied infinitely. And Bitcoin does this with the famous blockchain, which is a distributed public ledger that records all the transactions. And this approach, as implemented by Bitcoin, introduces latency issues and wasted a monstrous amount of electricity. And in a CBDC instead, the ledger is kept at the central bank. And since you trust dollars, then they say you might as well just trust the central bank to hold the ledger. So it's a slightly dodgy argument, but never mind. A centralized ledger is much simpler and much more computationally efficient, which is a good thing. But it allows the central bank to retain control of the currency, whereas the main ideological driver for the creation of Bitcoin was precisely to remove that control from the central bank. For example, printing additional currency is a stealth tax on anybody who saved any of the currency. And it is evil because it distorts the pricing reference. And this tricks members of the public into mismanaging their finances. But the governments want to be able to print currency rather than imposing explicit taxes that would make them unpopular. So the central bank would lose its pivotal role and its influence on the economy if the digital currency used for payments were created by some other entity. And for these reasons, governments are unlikely to allow any cryptocurrency to become a mainstream medium or exchange. And I credit Ray Dalio for this insight. So, as I view it, either Bitcoin will fail as the bubble of Bitcoin bursts, and then it will be irrelevant, or it will succeed, and then it will be banned and replaced by CBDCs. My second claim is that even though I believe that digital cash is inevitable, I heard no compelling motive to introduce it. Not the convenience of payment, because already achieved by stuff like Apple Watch. Not anonymity, because Bitcoin is not anonymous for normal people who have to buy it on an exchange and give their password. No, CBDC is even less anonymous by design, because unconditional anonymity is fundamentally incompatible with regulatory oversight. And to me, the most believable justification for CBDCs, although it's not one that's offered explicitly, is that governments and central banks don't want to be left out and lose control. My third claim is that digital cash won't eliminate crime. It will simply displace crime. And some honest and righteous citizens could be persuaded that they might like to trade their financial privacy in exchange for the elimination of tax evasion or the elimination of crime altogether. But that, I believe, is quite unlikely to happen. Criminals would not disappear. They would simply pivot towards other operating procedures. And if we were smarter, we would figure out what they are in place. My fourth claim is that we don't actually know what we need. Some of the desirable properties of digital cash are inherently incompatible with each other, and so we can't have them all. Even if we manage to invent technical constructions that make each of them individually feasible, which is what cryptographers have been doing since the 1980s. The two main axes along which I see irreconcilable tensions are anonymity of transactions versus control over the money supply. Should we allow traceability to prevent crime? No, sorry. Anonymity of transactions is one axis, and control of the money supply is another axis. On the first axis, should we allow traceability to prevent crime, or should we instead allow strong anonymity to protect civil liberties? And is this the end of my 8 minutes?
No.
That was somebody else.
Okay. And on the second axis, should we allow central banks to print currency to respond promptly to exceptional crises like COVID, or should we prevent currency manipulation to preserve the value of already issued currencies? And in each of these trade-offs, we can't have it both ways, no matter how clever the cryptographers are. And both extremes have undesirable consequences. And we haven't agreed as a society which ones are the ones we should aim for. My fifth and final claim is that deploying the wrong infrastructure could be disastrous. The People's Bank of China have been running trials since 2020 involving tens of thousands of people and over $100 million. And traceable money, expiring money, programmable money are not science fiction scenarios. They are things that have been trialed, and they are just an appetizer for even more disruptive future developments. Now, financial analysts report that Beijing wants a fully traceable digital yuan to strengthen the already formidable surveillance powers of the ruling Communist Party, serving their deep-seated impulse towards social control. And it may seem a great idea to make the currency of criminals vanish, but remember, it's the government of the day who decides who is a criminal. And so I want to cite the PGP creator Phil Zimmermann, who in 1996 famously observed in front of the US Congress that in a democracy, it is possible for bad people to occasionally get elected. This was 1996. Sometimes very bad people. Normally, a well-functioning democracy has ways to remove these people from power. But the wrong technological infrastructure could allow such a future government to watch every move anyone makes to oppose it. It could very well be the last government we ever elect. So my conclusion is, some of us are geeks who can program computers, and we can write the laws of physics of the digital society. And that's a superpower. And as Spider-Man's uncle put it, with great power comes great responsibility. So it's our moral duty, as I see, to write those laws of physics so the digital cash just does not allow the people in power to do certain evil things. Human laws and regulatory properties can be rewritten, but nobody is able to rewrite the law of gravity to make objects fall upwards. And that's the kind of safeguard that we need. So we have a moral duty to the rest of humanity to design digital cash in a way that makes it impossible for a government to do egregiously evil things with it. And to cite Phil Zimmermann again, ask which technologies would best strengthen the hand of the police state, and then do not allow the government to deploy those technologies. Thank you.
Cameron, you're up. Do you have questions?
Yes, PDF font. I labeled my last name.
Bam.
Hi, I'm Cami. I'm now at University of Waterloo. Last time I talked to you, I was at University of Edinburgh. I still run the Tulips Lab. Thankfully, a lab that is mostly a web page moves quite easily across the Atlantic. I do a whole bunch of research on lots of different things, from phishing, system administration, all sorts of stuff. Today, I was going to be talking about software updates, particularly why system administrators don't update stuff. So, I mean, I can show you a lot of statistics about things like Heartbleed and how many servers are still not updated. But things like this is perhaps a little bit more down to earth. This is a case in which a local food chain in Edinburgh, or the UK, just canceled a whole bunch of things. Why? Because they had an overnight software update that just broke everything. I moved to Waterloo, and the main train that connects us to Toronto just stopped running. And they're like, yeah, no, we updated something. We're on it. We're gonna fix that. Yeah, so patches or updates are really important for security. This is how we take known vulnerabilities and we make them be gone. Because if we know where the problem is, we just fix it. We're in a software world. We just roll it out worldwide. All done, no problems. And there's some issues like things that are disconnected or old, but there's a lot of stuff that could be updated but isn't. And the reason it isn't ranges. I mean, some of it is actually this variation. On one hand, we want to make sure that things like WannaCry, which is another attack, that, by the way, when it hit, there was a patch for, still took down global shipping, still took down the national health system for the UK, even though we had a patch. And then on the reverse side of things, we've got these fun patches that do things like just kind of delete some user data when you install them. And then we sit there and go, why aren't system administrators patching anything? I kid you not, I got a direct quote from one of the top people in the UK for doing security, and they're like, well, but it doesn't mess up that much stuff. And I'm like, have you been watching the news? Well, and if you're a system administrator, let's be blunt, there's a lot of stuff we know about system administrators, but one of the big ones is they are minimizing for somebody, a lot of people calling them. They don't like that. They don't like their boss calling them. They don't like any of that. So they minimize downtime, but they really don't want people calling them. We know a lot of other things about them, though. They're highly collaborative. We keep talking about how, you know, the general view in media is that they live in basements or something, but actually they collaborate quite a lot. They don't fully understand their own systems. Who could? Have you seen one of these things? And they're a technical broker, and this is kind of an interesting one. They spend a lot of time talking to chief information security officers, to the general public, to their users, and they take that information, then they turn around and they spend a bunch of time looking at the manuals and talking to the software vendors, and then they go and interview the computer and see what the computer is currently up to, and then you match all three of these together and you try to figure out which of them needs to be adjusted. possibly all of them. But they're a technical broker, right? They're almost just kind of moving these things around. It's like a switchboard operator, but with a lot of information that they're trying to pull in from all different sources, put together, and then construct things about this. And they also interact with a lot of security systems. Different project we did on phishing, we looked at when a phishing report comes in, what needs to be touched, and the answer is half the university. It's amazing how many teams and admin need to go and interact with the phishing report because each one of them does something different. System administrators, they interact with a lot of different systems if they're a small organization, or they interact with a lot of people who work with different systems if they're in a large one. And this is kind of just the general picture we have from other people's work. So when we kind of come back to this question of why aren't they updating stuff, I'm going to talk quickly through two studies that are related. This is a case study. What we decided to do was grab one update from Windows. Windows is nice. They number each of their updates, which is highly Google friendly. So we took one update, which Windows annoyingly has 3 numbers for, but it's basically all the same update. And we just tracked it. And we said, let's find everything on the internet we can linked to just this update. And then we picked one that was initially listed as critical, had an in the wild exploit at the time of release. This is the textbook definition of what we want updated. Had problems after release, and Microsoft actually weighed in at one point during this process. This is the timeline. Patch is released on Patch Tuesday, it was the second Tuesday of the month, and the communities that we were monitoring don't give an all clear that this is safe to actually install this patch until the 30th of the month. This is not good. We should be installing that back closer to the 8th, not the 30th. There are 2 hotfix releases to this case from Microsoft. But this is actually an interesting case because the problem I mentioned just there, the thing that stops everyone from updating, is that if you have 2 monitor systems, this happens to your second monitor. This is interesting because if you've got a nice test system, did you give it 2 monitors? Maybe you had a VM. But no, you probably didn't have 2 monitors. So this is a case where you see system administrators doing a combination of testing, but also having to do a lot of information foraging. I mentioned technical broker later, right? They're trying to both test it locally, but also kind of put their hand on the space out on the internet and seeing what maybe is influencing, what's going wrong, what's happening to other people. So that's kind of one study. We found a lot of information foraging on this. It's quite interesting. Coming out of that, we also started going, why aren't people testing things? We were looking at a lot of information foraging in this and what people are posting online, but we're not seeing a lot of test information. So we did a survey on this. There are many details in the paper. About 220 participants. They were all online. They all thought that they were admins. We didn't highly justify whether they were or not. We kind of do believe it. There's a lot of results in that paper, but one of the big ones is around testing and what kind of testing environments they have. Because if you pull open the advice reports from almost any security agency you name, they will almost all say the same thing. Update, update, update. Install your update. If you're concerned, you should test it. So we kind of broke this down based on whether they were dealing with clients or servers and the different types of testing they can use and also the organization size. So the bars on the left are a large organization. The ones on the right are a small and medium-sized organization, so about 500 people or less. And you can see a lot of variation here. So positively, we don't have a lot of people. Oh, and they can check more than one box. So if you do some math, you will find it gets over 100%. Because some people do a mix. I did check, and the no testing group actually doesn't check other boxes. Sanity checks on these things. But no testing is thankfully actually pretty rare. But when you hear testing, you always assume, maybe they're doing this in this fancy server that looks identical to the real fancy server. Heck no. There's a whole range. You have everything from a couple computers. I would define this as I installed this. Okay. So yeah, we don't have as much testing as we would like, but it's a mix. And then I'm doing some research on information foraging, and I'm in because I wrote it.
Nice. Rick, you're up. You're no slides?
I have no slides.
All right, go for it.
Just do the W, then we'll have a nice white background.
I missed my 2 minutes.
I'm sorry, I was too busy listening to what you were saying.
Thank
You
you.
were so engrossing.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Rick Wash. I'm a social scientist, but today I want to talk about a philosophy project that I'm working on with Alan and with one of our colleagues, Clinton Castro. We're trying to think about what is cybersecurity, and our real goal is to try to think through, to try to understand when are we doing a good job on cybersecurity. We kind of need to know what we're trying to do in order to figure out what we're trying to do a good job. So we're trying to think through what are we trying to do. And figured a good place to start is by looking at definitions of cybersecurity. So I went and I collected a bunch of definitions of cybersecurity. Every last one of them was different. For example, the US government, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, at one point defined cybersecurity as the ability to protect or defend the use of cyberspace against cyber attacks.
Cyber.
Yes, cyber appeared twice in the definition of cybersecurity. The UK National Cyber Strategy defines it as the protection of information systems, the data on them, and the services they provide from unauthorized access, harm, or misuse. So both of those definitions are about protecting against some kind of attacks. They assume that there is some objective reality about being attacked, and that stopping that, so that there's an objective reality about stopping those attacks, and that's the most important piece of cybersecurity. Compare that to a definition that I found in Simpson Garfinkel and Gene Spafford's book. A computer is secure if you can depend on it and its software to behave as expected. That's a very subjective version of cybersecurity. So as expected is in the user's mind, what the user expects the computer to do. And depend on it is actually something that the users do who are using the computer. They depend on it. And so being able to depend on something is a very subjective notion. I think cybersecurity needs both an objective idea of security and a subjective idea of security. Since this is security and human behavior, I want to talk through some ideas about what this subjective side of security might be. There's a philosopher, Waldron, who was looking at national security and trying to think through what national security is. And he came up with 3 different ways of thinking about what the subjective side of national security is. First, he said, you have security if you are without fear, if you're not afraid. So you have physical security if you can go outside of your house without being afraid of being physically attacked. So if you're not afraid of attacks, then you have security. A second notion is kind of recognizes that security is not just about right now, but it's also about the future. So you have security if you have an assurance about the future, not just that you're not going to be attacked now, but you're also not going to be attacked in the future. And so future assurance is an important piece of cybersecurity. And then third, Waldron takes this one step further and says security is really like a way of doing things. He calls it a mode of enjoyment. And so you can do things, you can live securely, which is living with security and living your life in that way. It wasn't very specific about that. So we went into looking at some of the other parts of the philosophy literature to try to find better ideas of what that might be. And we came across this really interesting notion of trust that came from T. Nguyen, who's a philosopher. And he was asking the question of, what does it mean to trust an object, like your computer? If you want to trust your computer, what does it mean to do that, to trust your computer? And he argued that trusting an object, so he used an example of, if you're a rock climber and you have a rope, when do you trust your rope? Trusting is more than just relying on the rope. Trusting the rope is when you take its reliability as an unquestioning attitude. So you don't question whether this is reliable. You trust it and use it as if it was reliable no matter what. It's not to say that you never questioned it. You might have questioned it in the past, decided it was trustworthy, but now you're trusting it by not questioning it. And when you do that, what ends up happening is you take that object and put it into your agency, into your cognition. For people who are social scientists in the room, it's very similar to the concept of distributed cognition. My brain is more than just what's in my head. It's also the devices around me that I trust and I use to help me think. This is my external memory, for example. So this is very similar to the Garfinkel and Spafford idea of security, of cybersecurity. You can depend on your devices if you trust them by taking this unquestioning attitude towards them and being able to use them to do important things in your life. Now, there's a lot that we can say about whether we have this objective notion and this subjective notion. There's a lot you can say about the relationship between them and whether the subjective feeling of security is actually justified by the objective reality or whether you're delusional. I'm going to leave that aside for another talk. It's an important question. That maybe next year. I want to talk about, in the last couple minutes, a really interesting implication of, 2 minutes left, perfect. An interesting implication of this. So we talk about this subjective notion's feeling of security is we're treating users as the subjects of security. The reason we're doing security is to create this feeling inside of the users that makes them, that gets them to do more things in their life and do them in a secure way. That's treating users as the subject of security. If you compare that to, in the past at SHB, I've talked about my phishing research. The whole first panel was talking about trying to train users to do more security, to be more paranoid, to react to warnings more efficiently. That's treating users as tools of security. So fundamentally, there are these kind of two different roles that users have. They're the subjects of security, where we're trying to get them to feel more comfortable and more willing to do things in the world. And they're tools of security, where they need to be more paranoid and more helpful in actually enforcing that security. And the conception, the definition of security doesn't actually, there's kind of this tension between them, where if you go too far in one direction, you make them only tools, then they can't actually use that security productively in the world. But if you go too far in the other direction and make them totally unquestioning of their devices, then they're vulnerable to attacks. That trust is a vulnerability. And so there's a balance that needs to happen in this tension that the concept, the definition of security doesn't actually help us solve. And one of the interesting points that I was thinking about during this first session is that we actually put, where do you fall in that balance? Do you try to push people more towards being a tool or more towards using it in the world? We put that pressure on users to figure out where in that balance they are. Thank you.
Do you have something?
No slides.
Awesome.
I'm Josephine Wolff. I'm at Tufts University. I'm going to talk today about some work that I'm doing with Dan Schwartz at Minnesota and Daniel Woods at Edinburgh. And we talked some smack in the last session about consultants. This is a project that's sort of going after lawyers, which we haven't really had a chance to do yet today. And it's a project that actually doesn't start with any desire to criticize lawyers. It starts with this puzzle we encounter in some of our earlier work, which is we talk to a bunch of people at cyber insurance firms, which is something all three of us are interested in, and many of the underwriters say to us, sort of to our surprise, look, we just don't have good data about the incidents we cover, right? We have one underwriter say to us, I have information about fewer than 5% of the incidents that people file claims with for our insurance. We're sort of hearing some parallel things from regulators, folks at like the New York Department of Financial Services, saying we're trying to investigate incidents, we're trying to learn about what's happening when there are security problems, and we can't get information. Right, we're being told either there are no reports, we have no documentation to share with you about this, or in some cases there is a report, but our lawyers say we can't share it with you for confidentiality reasons. And so this is a study, an interview study, where we tried to understand what are the implications of having lawyers run most of the incident response for cybersecurity. In particular, what are the implications for the digital forensics and incident response people who are sort of doing the technical work? What are some of the constraints they're placed under? And finally, are there ways to sort of try to make it easier for us to learn from these incidents and facilitate that a little better? We talked to 70 people, slightly more than half of them were lawyers or breach coaches who kind of oversee this type of incident response work. Another quarter were from DFIR firms, people who do kind of technical forensics work, and the other quarter were insurers and regulators, trying to understand sort of from a couple different perspectives what are the implications, and also just what are the practices that lawyers implement. And what we find sort of in that first set of questions around what do lawyers do, why do they do it, is that they place a really high premium on confidentiality of everything that comes out of these investigations. And there are kind of two mechanisms in the United States for that. One is attorney-client privilege, and the other is something called work product doctrine. Both of them are designed to say, look, this thing we've created or these conversations we've had about this incident are not admissible if there's going to be some kind of class action lawsuit. If somebody's going to sue you for this data breach, you're not going to have to turn over the report we wrote. You're not going to have to reveal any of the sort of details of what we found in this investigation. And I think it's, in my most charitable interpretation, a strategy that makes some sense if you're dealing with a big breach of personal information and you're really worried about a class action lawsuit, and you might say, we really need to guard against liability. What I think is interesting is, as sort of the threat landscape evolves, and we see a lot of incidents where they're not breaches of personal information, but ransomware attacks or other types of incident where you might be less worried about liability, where certainly we see a lot less litigation. This set of practices that the law firms overseeing incident response develop continues to be used kind of across that spectrum of incidents. The kinds of practices we identify through our interviews, first of all, the law firms feel very strongly that you have to have a different DFIR firm investigate after an incident than the one that you had sort of doing work for your firm beforehand, because that's how you prove we were really doing this work just to protect ourselves from liability. This wasn't work that was sort of already happening before an incident. There's a lot of concern over who's going to contract them. That has to come from the law firm. Who's going to pay them? Sometimes that's also being funneled through the law firm. And then a huge amount of concern about what's being written down. Is this something that, if it were introduced in court, might cause any kinds of problems? So for instance, most of the DFIR people told us, and many of the lawyers did as well, we're not allowed to make any recommendations. Right? We're not allowed to say you should do this or you should do that. Some of them even said we're really not allowed to write anything down now about what went wrong or what security controls were in place or which ones failed. And the lawyers we talked to confirmed a lot of this. They said, look, we're doing this to protect our clients. This is really important. And what that means when we sort of look at, especially the last 4 years, is that there's this really significant shift to not documenting things. And the big catalyst for that is actually a specific lawsuit around a Capital One data breach, which is decided in 2020. And Capital One hires a very fancy law firm called Debevoise & Plimpton, which does everything right, does all of those sort of safeguards to say everything's completely confidential. And Capital One is sued. The plaintiffs try to get the investigation report turned over, and the court says, yeah, you have to turn that over, right? That's not just something you prepared for legal purposes, that's something you did for business purposes as well, to understand what went wrong with your security. And at that point, many of the lawyers we talked to said, after Capital One, we just can't have reports anymore, right? At most, we can do a sort of voice briefing about here are some things you should maybe consider for the future, but we can't write anything down because we don't know how to protect it. Right, everything that we sort of thought worked to preserve confidentiality in those circumstances, it turns out really doesn't. And we see that reflected also in our interviews with regulators and with insurers about their ability to sort of try and collect information about a lot of these incidents following 2020 and following that shift in behavior. And I think sort of the things that worry me about this, the things that make me feel this is a problem that's worth spending some time and attention trying to solve, is it then means that all of our ability to sort of collect data about past security incidents and learn from them is really circumscribed by the fears of lawyers around what are we actually going to be allowed to write down, what kinds of consequences could there be for doing that. There are a couple different approaches for trying to solve this. None of them are perfect. We talked to some insurance firms that said we've actually drafted language for our contracts that would require policyholders to give us information about incidents if they file a claim, but we're scared to actually ask them to sign those contracts because we think they might go to one of our competitors, because most people aren't doing that and we don't want to lose clients out. And so the insurers themselves are worried about this. The other thing they say is, look, we also provide commercial general liability insurance to a lot of these companies. So if they do get sued and they have to turn over these reports because we forced them to write it, we're going to be the ones who are paying out those settlement fees and those lawyer fees. We talked to regulators about this as well. I would just note, right, they're also thinking a lot about information reporting and whether there are ways to mandate more of this being turned over. They're also concerned about questions of, are we going to disincentivize certain types of information collecting or documentation if we say that then has to be shared with the government in some capacity. And so there's, I think, a lot of interest among regulators in trying to make progress on this, but a lot of uncertainty about how to do it. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Outstanding panel. We have everyone stayed for time, and we have plenty of time for discussion. Start with Gene in the back.
I actually have 2 questions.
one is, and they're totally different. So one is to Adam, and I wondered if you looked at the domestic violence arrest records of any of the people, and it just didn't matter, and you just couldn't get it. And the other is to Sascha. And I just wonder if there is a change, because I'll just, maybe I'm getting stupider, but maybe cryptography is just getting more difficult, and fewer people can understand it, right? I mean, you could prove RSA and secret sharing me walking drunk, right? I mean, they're really straightforward. And the latest, attack on Lattice has been out there for 30 days, and people, who know what they're doing, maybe a couple hundred people. So how has this radical population shift from the people who understand it to the scale of the people who use it change your model? And I can't resist telling a funny story about my own research. Thank you for your patience. We did a bunch of interviews of cryptographers at Real World Crypto and policymakers in DC. And the Real World Crypto people were like, we need some policy guidance. And the people at DC were like, those cryptographers better be careful what they're doing. They are responsible for this.
I'll let Sascha go first and then Adam.
Excellent question. I don't have an answer. But I think, maybe yes. I mean, we also have more people working on cryptography, right? It's not just that, like, number of people using it, blew up. But, like, it wasn't, like, a particular focus in this study. But, maybe yes. I think that's my answer.
Adam.
Yeah, so we didn't look specifically. We did pick up quite a lot of additional crimes. So not only domestic violence, but also kind of drugs related and various other. And until relatively recently, especially in the US, there was a real reticence against convicting people of terrorist-based offences if they were extreme right-wingers. It's only been recently. So often they were actually kind of imprisoned for something like, improper storage of weapons, but when you read the case, they were kind of in a garage with explosives and Mein Kampf and detailed plans. But so it was a kind of Al Capone thing. So it was very difficult to unpick. But we were definitely picking up domestic violence as well as other offences. But then it was kind of we didn't specifically look at it.
Bruce.
It's a question for Josephine. The CSRB, the Computer Security Review Board, lacks subpoena power. I think it's one of the things we often say it needs. Is that something that you think would help, would hurt, is good? If the CSRB could demand documents in a way that, like the aircraft equivalent, they can't be used in court.
Yeah, I think that would be good, but I think it's somewhat tangential to the larger question of kind of large-scale data collection around incidents, because the CSRB does such a sort of deep dive into a small set of incidents. So I think that could be useful for them in kind of the cases they look at. I'm not sure that I could see it sort of scaling to the question of how do we learn from a large set of ransomware incidents or something like that.
Next in line is Luca.
I have maybe also questions. One quick comment following up on this. I mean, to what extent do you have the perception that the system admin's behavior is actually rational to a group in terms of expectations, or whether they should take that or not, I mean, take action on that or not? And the second is actually for Rick, that I really enjoy the perspective and the sort of interplay between the definition of the attack that you have to be concerned about and the feeling of security that you have to experience when you use technology. But I was sort of triggered when you mentioned trust and brought to mind the class from the lecture from Ken Thompson for his Turing Award and the reflections on trust and trust. They essentially show that effectively there is nothing you can really trust, very fundamentally and fairly technically. Yeah? And of course that plays into what is the threat model you're concerned of. What is it, the level of security, the kind of threat you have to be concerned about to feel secure. So maybe I wanted to trigger you a little bit on this necessity for users to have an idea of the threat they have to be concerned about realistically is within the sphere of what they consider secure. And so, yeah.
I'll let Rick go for we give reverse order because that's fresh question. So
Fresh question. All right. Well, I think it's a great question. And one of the things that comes up is when we talk about the objective side of security, we frequently talk about specific threats. You're secure against one threat, but not against another threat. And that's a totally reasonable way to talk about security. When we talk about the subjective feelings side of security, it's usually when most people don't think of it as, and I think this is an empirical question that I'd love to follow up on as a social scientist, it's usually not about specific threats, but rather that it's about what you're trying to do. So I'm secure enough to go to the grocery store. It's not that I'm just worried about specific people attacking me physically, is that I want to go to the grocery store and get some food, and I'm secure enough to do that. And so both sides of security are relative to something, relative to a threat or relative to an action, but it's different things that they're relative to. And I think that's part of the interesting disconnect when you start talking about, is there an appropriate match between the objective and the subjective sides of security? Is that they're both relative, but they're relative to different things, and it makes it hard to figure out whether that match is there.
and this is a main question.
So I defer to Alessandro about rational behavior, but as this mistake of assuming that admins are patching or not patching, and there's a whole rainbow of actions they can do in the middle. Like they can only patch maybe some of the systems. They can decide to delay a patch is actually the biggest one. Adam Shostak went and did some opinion piece for a bunch of business people a while back, and it produced this huge body of work I cannot understand, in which they're trying to balance the risks between how long you should wait. So there's some system administrators that decide that none of this is worth their time, and they patch exactly 1 month minus 1 day late. Every single time. It was great. One of the email lists we went and were looking at, this one guy's like, has Microsoft screwed this up? Like, why is all my patches, these are all the new ones, and I'm supposed to have the last month's one, this panic. And he's like, no, this is a month that started on a Tuesday. And so what's happened is the most minimal amount of time has happened between that and the second Tuesday. And so he accidentally installed the most recent patches. And this is such a serious issue. And this is a very standard behavior actually for them, is to minimize risk and minimize their time by just patching 1 month late under the assumption that everyone else will have fixed it by then. And whether it's rational or not depends a lot on their circumstances, what they're protecting, what they're being attacked by. So it's really hard to make a judgment on that. But when you talk to them, they are reasoning about it a lot. They haven't just idly done this. I mean, the patch 1 month late perhaps is the closest to idly doing this. But they have reasoning when you talk to them. They are thinking about the problem.
So my current ordering is Susan, Vabav, Andrew, Samir.
I'll pass.
You'll pass? Okay. So Vabav, and then,
So I have a quick question for Sascha. So I was just wondering, so when you say like, crypto deployments are getting bumpy, just want what are some of the examples of things that, that you'd like to see deployed that maybe are not getting deployed? And then I was also wondering if you have sort of thought about all of the additional dependencies for crypto to be deployed, right? It is standardization process, as you said, right? They're quite, they can be many years long. But then you also need a lot of infrastructure, right? For any new crypto algorithm, you need crypto accelerators in a lot of cases, right? And there's a long development timeline for chip manufacturers to actually make them. So have you sort of considered those factors and how those sort of slow down crypto deployment?
Yeah, I think what we heard often was that connecting pieces in terms of translators are missing. So we have those theory bubble, we have a standardization bubble, we have an implementers bubble, we have a designers bubble, and it seems like one of the biggest challenges really is kind of bringing them together and making them talk the same language and kind of understanding kind of the requirements from the one end of the path to the other. I think that's what we heard most often, and what kind of makes lots of sense to me, right? And the first one was
just what kind of deployments you would like to see that you feel are missing?
Yeah, good question. Maybe not missing, but I think it'll be an interesting kind of observation and experience to see how PQC is getting deployed in the future, and kind of seeing if like we experience the same challenges like we saw in the past.
Andrew Adams.
Yeah, comment and maybe a question for Rick. You talked about users perhaps being security subjects or security tools. I think you're missing an element there where users are also security objects. So that's just a comment there. On this conceptualization of what security, I remember back when I was based in the UK, I was doing security technology research under EU projects. I often had this issue where talking to German and French researchers in particular, I'd say things like, well, this is an interesting question in security design. We could learn from safety design here. And they would look at me blankly and go, security, safety, there's no difference. Because in French and German, they're the same word. Now, when I moved to Japan, Japanese has two different words, anshin and anzen. And the best way I can translate these to English is anshin, and you can get this from the kanji characters in that, is about feelings. So the shin there is heart, whereas anzen is the second half of that one, but the first half is the same, is totality. And the way I translate those is anshin is the feeling of security and safety, because they don't make the security safety distinction happen. Whereas anzen is the actual objective concept. So I think there's interesting things there you can learn from looking at the languages, the different languages people use, and the different conceptualizations they give them about what is security, what is safety. Because some of the things you talked about to me were more safety rather than security. But also you've got this split between feeling and objective reality.
I completely agree. One of the things I did was actually dive into the history of the word security, which is from ancient Latin. Sine cura, without fear, or without care is actually a better translation. What the original, if you go back like the BCE era, the word security really was about how you lived your life. You lived your life without caring about things in the world. And it didn't take them long to figure out, it took, well, not long, a couple hundred years, when you're talking ancient Rome, right? But a couple hundred years into using of that word, it was very much just a feeling in the original conception 2,000 years ago. And over time, it evolved. And in order to be able to do that without being totally delusional, you also had to have this feeling, this actual objective reality. So it started out as a feeling, the word started out as a feeling, and it moved into this objective reality, and then you can trace it up through like Hobbes and stuff that made it much more into like a political reality and put much more emphasis on the objective sides of it. Over time, and it kind of, in some ways, almost lost the both. But it's interesting because the connotations in English still have both aspects of it, that there's this important security safety distinction. But in other languages, I'm really interested to hear more about the Japanese distinction, because I think that's a really interesting one.
You got a quick follow on?
No, but I
Okay. And you have a new question.
So, Rick, my colleague with Diffie used to talk about locks being a way to make your car secure when you park it in a bad neighborhood. And the way it splits and the kind of way you're looking at it is, you can still park your car in a bad neighborhood, but it didn't used to be people took their wheels off and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so that's the two kinds of ways you're thinking about security. Yeah. Sascha, I remember when unlike most people in the room, I remember when RSA was developed. And we expected, easy math, it's going to be implemented, right? It wasn't implemented until the web came along, okay, and PGP. It wasn't implemented till then. And you didn't see, when the NSA and the White House and EU changed its rules about encryption and the export of equipment with strong encryption, we all expected, maybe Bruce was cynical, but I don't remember that being so. We all expected to see products with strong encryption. Didn't happen until post-Snowden. You only saw data being protected on mobile devices in the late 2000s after devices were being stolen, and not the devices were stolen, but then data was taken off. So what you're missing is the whole piece about what they're missing. You're not missing it, but they're missing is the whole set of incentives, and the incentives aren't aligned to make it move faster. If the incentives are aligned to make it move faster, if U.S. government says we're not buying any equipment without post-quantum encryption in, you'll see that not only in the stuff sold to the government, but everywhere, because once you put it in, it's that set of incentives that the cryptographers and the standardization people don't talk about, but it's right there.
Yeah.
So, current running order questions: Samir, Damon, Mark, Zena, Ben. And then I'll add you. But so, Samir.
Okay, so we've heard about individual components, like sysadmins, users, lawyers, CISOs, but we haven't heard a lot about how these interact. And I'm wondering so for example, right, insurers don't have a lot of information, but they're still basing their models on something and requiring stuff. And it could be that what they're requiring, because they don't have information, or worse, have bad information, is actually counterintuitively bad for security. And that makes things then worse for users, which makes it worse for insurers. Then it kind of creates this cycle of instituting even worse policies or requirements, right? So an example would be we railed on the phishing training thing, and like all universities, our university has that. And I think it's at least part of it, if not all of it, is because they will not be able to get the appropriate cyber insurance, or it's a requirement from the insurance company that you have to have these drills. And then that can create ripple effects down the line where users either feel bad about them, get habituated, and then so I'm wondering what people feel about now that we've heard about these individual pieces. Is the interaction creating these circles that are derailing things rather than helping?
I'll start with a combination of a funny story and just the general opinion that I think this is a hot potato game. I think every group tries to toss the problem of liability at the next group and claim that that's not their problem because of it. But when I first moved to the United Kingdom, I went to some event that was supposed to be for like security professionals. I show up and there's a shocking number of women present, and this is just, I'm happy to see women present, but it does tend to put a little alarm bells in the back of your head. And then I discovered a good chunk of them were lawyers in the room, because apparently we were discussing a law issue that day. And I was like, how are you assessing this? I'm actually really curious. I just moved to the UK. She's like, oh no, it's not a problem anymore. There's this cyber essentials thing. Deadpan look at me saying this. Straight up. And I'm standing there going, okay. That's how we're doing, what's that? So, and I see this everywhere. I mean, you look at developers, you ask them, is your code secure? I mean, to quote search, well, of course it's secure. Google Play let it on, and they must have scanned it, right? Or you say, okay, well, you installed this ad library. Is that legal under the various laws across the entire world? Well, yes, I just downloaded the library. They would have ensured that it's legal over the various codes. No, they have not. The admins are a lot more, they don't trust anyone. So no, they do not believe statements from Microsoft that say that this will run and not cause problems. But they're not liability, right? So you look at one of the biggest things that they do make decisions based on, it's the policy of the organization. The organization says you must patch within 14 days. They patch within 14 days, even if that crashes everything. But that policy is a nice liability. Drop onto someone else. Well, the system crashed, but this piece of paper said that I'm required to do this. Hot potato game.
All right. So, reminds me of the quote from the late David Wheeler: all problems in computer science can be solved by another layer of direction or abstraction. All right. Okay, so moving on to Dana.
All right, I had a question for Alan. And so, full disclaimer, I'm named in the particular lawsuit a project. So I work on a project, the Virality project. And so I have a kind of a professional stake.
Or a personal stake?
I want to separate the personal from professional. They are two different lives. And so, I mean, I feel like as a misinformation researcher, we had been making progress in building out the information sharing constructs, and then this lawsuit and the other kind of circus surrounding this, the Elon Musk Twitter files and the conspiracy theory and all that, has kind of had a chilling effect where, regardless of how this case is settled, a lot of this information sharing has gone away, and people are worried because of this polarization of this topic. And so, as a misinformation researcher, I'm wondering, how do we continue to make progress, and how do we safely reconstruct what I felt like was very beneficial information sharing, but now we have this risk of all this polarization and legal issues and First Amendment rights of being enjoined by this judge in Louisiana, so they can't talk to the judiciary and companies.
Yeah, I don't have a straightforward answer there, and I don't know how the Supreme Court is gonna rule here, right? So, honestly, it seems to me that the case is really weak. I mean, this came up in the Western District of Louisiana. Well, yeah, right. I mean, there's a whole sort of philosophy of law thing. What actually is the law of the case? Are we just making predictions about what courts are going to do? Is there a fact of the matter? I tend to think there's a legal fact of the matter, and the court may get it wrong. But it was a particular partisan circuit or district court and circuit court, and the appellate court decision didn't really weigh in particularly well on the government speech side. That is, the communications from governments to social media platforms is a form of protected speech from the government that just can't be coercive.
What about researchers too?
Right. Well, that's a whole. I mean, that seems clearly within rights of researchers to communicate. One of the, I don't have an on the ground answer. What I can say is that I think that this gets wrapped up in speech arguments. That's very legalistic, and I think it misses an important component. I think that it is, in a really important sense, a security debate, right? That for certain really important values, and all of these are, in my view, I'm a philosopher, I think all these are at some point a value, or at some point value questions. I think that they're really important things that researchers like yourself, government actors like the CISA, FBI, at least in some cases, are trying to advance. Those are justifiable, and in terms of security, with the right referent for security, I'd like to see it sort of cashed out and argued in that kind of way. Whether that'll be effective, I'm not the right person to weigh in there.
So briefly, I'm wondering how, not for the legal question, but you're talking about how private organizations are sharing this information and it's caused this political blowback. I'm wondering how that connects to some of Adam's research, which is basically saying that people are hateful all the time, but there's actually this much smaller subset that appears to actually lead to translation to action. If more limited sharing become more palatable politically.
I think that's great. That's fantastic, and I really want to bookmark that to talk a long time, between sessions about. My first gloss here is that what he's pointing to is the know-how discussions are where security actually lies, and other sorts of values, the speech values of people who are really angry and disaffected and resentful, are themselves a particular, or have a kind of value that's worth protecting. Like that environment should be secure, whereas you've got a way to identify what the real important thing is, or that's making progress there. That's the gloss, but it's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with that, but also one of the concerns we have always had is about just wide-scale surveillance of all kind of speech, and that's one of the things that motivated us to look much more closely at targeted rather than just at speech more generally, which I think kind of echoes that point.
Great. Mark?
Thanks. I have two, if I can fit them in. I think they're relatively quick. First, for Rick. As it relates to the more subjective conception of security and trust, I'm curious if you came across anything around measuring trust. This is a problem that my team has banged our head against a lot, and one of the things we've run into specifically is measuring users' trust in our service, our product, through the perception or through the angle of privacy, safety, security. All these concepts are entangled. That's what we work on specifically. What's really hard, though, is to disentangle that from their experience or perceptions of pure reliability of the app, and not necessarily reliability having to do with security or privacy, but just like, does this thing work when I need it to work? Does it crash? Does the core function of sending and receiving messages happen every time I want it to?
But availability is a part of trust, part of security.
Yes, yes. Anyway, we could follow up, and I'm curious if you've come across any good trust measurement frameworks that have to do with this.
That's a good question. A lot of the work, especially in philosophy on trust, is about interpersonal trust, and the measurements that end up resulting are about, do I believe that you're going to take my interests into account? When you're talking about trusting a computer or a piece of software, it's a lot more complicated because computers don't have motivations, and so they don't make independent decisions. And so it's a really difficult question of what are you trusting? Are you trusting the computer? Are you trusting Meta, the people that made it? Are you trusting the whole system of the world that enforces rules around it? What are you trusting is a really complicated question. And that's one of the reasons we embarked on this project, was to try to figure out what is a way to think about what this trust is so that we can hopefully try to measure it. And so I haven't found good answers to that yet, but that's one of the things that I'm working towards, and I'd love to try to work on.
Angelo Sass also has some interesting work in the early 2000s about how people trust companies online for online commerce. If you haven't seen it,
thank you both. I'll pass it on.
Okay,
Sounds Frank, it's for you. I'll connect with you back.
Okay, so we've got 4 questions in 8 minutes, so try to be brief and only ask. So Zina's next.
Okay, so I have a question to Josephine, or maybe not quite question. So my mental model of lawyers is that they not only have confidentiality culture, they have kind of confidentiality fetish. Whatever they are doing, it doesn't matter. It's always confidentiality. So have you noticed something like this?
So I like that phrase a lot. I wish we'd used it. So here's what I would say about the lawyers and the confidentiality. I think there's a moment in the early 2000s when most of the insurance is for breaches of personal information, and the insurers actually see that it makes a big difference to involve a lawyer very early on, because there is a big litigation risk, and having a law firm involved early can help with that. And they then institutionalize that as part of their insurance policies. And so some of the insurance firms we talk to now say, actually, the phone number we give out to our policyholders, that just goes straight to the law firm, right? We don't even need to talk to them when there's an incident. And what I think the lawyers are doing now, and some of them will even sort of say this in somewhat explicit terms, is they are trying to cling to their relevance in a world where a lot of incidents are not breaches of personal information. And so how do you justify a lawyer should be overseeing every ransomware response? And part of the way they do that is they say, look, we are the ones who can provide this confidentiality. And so I think you're right to say there's, a little bit of a sort of fetish or obsession around this. I think it's not necessarily for its own sake, but more of a kind of, what do we bring to this process? And the lawyers will say, look, we bring management skills, right? Like we are, better running a team than some of the DFIR people, but that's not so unique. And we bring the confidentiality.
Ben?
So I'm listening to Adam, really interesting, and particularly interesting on the pathway model, which is just going everywhere now, and it's in counter cybercrime, it's in all sorts of other areas of law enforcement. But I'm interested to know where you think it's coming from, why it seems to have such a grip on law enforcement policy. Is it coming from the kind of broader prevent style way of doing these types of crimes, or is it coming from measurement? Because we see this in our own research on cybercrime forums. You've got that data to measure, you can do all your models and stuff, but actually the people you really want log on once, they drop Mirai, and then they get lost. So yeah, where's it coming from?
So I feel a bit mean saying this since I trained as a psychologist, but I think it's because the psychologists like to measure stuff like attitudes, beliefs, and all the models around collective action are around kind of, that you have grievances, that you have a sense of collective efficacy, and that finally you reach this tipping point where you're angry and you think by doing something you can do something about it and you can change the setting. And these are all models by social psychologists primarily, because they're studying people's minds, and so they ask them, and so I think that's why that model's gone. But I mean, we ended up doing the more behavioural stuff because we were looking at kind of dark web carding forums, which were all in Russian. So we couldn't really look at the language. We just had to look at patterns of behaviour instead, and that is what kind of moved us into looking at what behaviour can predict, rather than you can't go and ask kind of would-be terrorists to fill out questionnaires all the time.
Only sometimes they have their limits.
Question to Sascha or anyone else who wants to answer it. On Sascha's presentation, you highlighted reusing faulty or incomplete code bases as one of the risks. Like in software supply chain, we have like the software bill of materials to help deal with that kind of issue. We have standards that are codified, for instance, and there's now also a crypto bill of materials, CBOM, right, that can be used as part of the Cyclone standard. Is that something you're familiar with? Is anyone familiar with it, and is it useful? Is the question, because I'm not a photographer. And SBOM has been, there's an executive order on it. There's been so much time consumed in the U.S. about it. It's already baked into some EU legislation. But I don't see the corresponding development necessarily in the crypto world. Just wondering if there's something you can say to that or anyone else who feels involved.
Well, you should talk to Jean behind you at lunch for one. So she's one of Alan Friedman's one of her students. That was kind of his baby. It was SBOM. So anyway.
Really actually, as PDX in part because, and this is something I realize we talk about sensitive information here, so you should learn this here and not in the street. SPDX originally had shown one as an improved
Any other reactions from this side or no?
I mean, I think we haven't heard it in the interviews, so
Okay.
it's really like
interesting.
Yeah.
Simpson, I think it's maybe the last question.
So thanks to Rick for the call out earlier on in his talk. I'm interested in always distinguishing between trusted systems and trustworthy systems. And somebody a long time ago told me that a trusted system is a system that can violate your security policy and you have no recourse. And I just can't find the source of that quote.
I think Brian Snow said that first. Brian Snow said that to me first. I don't know. Brian Snow.
I think it was Robert Morris Sr. who was, at the time he said it, probably at the Security Protocols Workshop, retired from Chief Scientist of the NSA.
We should explain the Brian Snow reference.
Yeah.
Right, so I haven't been able to find the reference, but you can get it to me. But it's a really important distinction to me, because people outside this room tend to use the two terms interchangeably. We hope that our trusted systems are trustworthy, and largely they aren't, which is why we're here.
So on that positive note, I think we're ready for lunch break.
All right, so lunch is outside. Thanks, speakers.
Thank you.